The morning air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, but the peace the widower had hoped for felt foreign. He glanced at his two children, their faces pressed to the windows of the car, their excited chatter a distant murmur as the wheels crunched over the gravel road leading to the remote eco-lodge. Their mother had passed months ago, leaving a void that not even the quiet of the forest could fill. He had hoped that this getaway would restore some semblance of calm, a break from the constant grief that haunted his every waking moment. But as the lodge emerged from the misty woods, an inexplicable unease settled in his chest. What was supposed to be an escape was beginning to feel like something else. And when they arrived, the strange welcome the lodge provided only deepened his concern. The lodge, nestled on the edge of Owan Creek, stood still against the rising fog. The kids ran ahead, eager to explore, but he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The walls of the lodge creaked with every gust of wind, and the creek, usually serene, seemed to whisper as the water churned slightly more aggressively than he remembered. At first he thought it was the wind, but then the footsteps began, soft at first, almost imperceptible against the rustling of the leaves, but they were there. Each night, as the family settled into their rooms, he would hear the heavy, deliberate steps pacing the water's edge. The sound echoed through the silence, growing louder as the darkness deepened. The children, oblivious to the growing dread in their father's heart, would sleep soundly, unaware of the terror lurking just outside their door. But he couldn't escape it. And then, one night, just as he stepped outside to investigate, the footsteps stopped. He stood frozen, his eyes scanning the pitch-black night, but saw nothing. The silence was deafening. What was causing these footsteps? And why did they stop when he looked outside? The next day, the unease grew stronger. The morning sun seemed unwilling to burn through the dense mist that clung to the ground, making the whole place feel like a forgotten memory. It was on that day that he met the fisherman. The man appeared out of nowhere, standing silently by the creek with an old, weathered fishing rod in hand. His clothes were faded and torn, and his eyes, dull and lifeless, seemed to hold an eternity of secrets. "They're coming," the man rasped, his voice cracked and low, as though the words were forced out of him. The widower, still shaken from the night before, asked, "Who's coming?" But the fisherman simply nodded toward the creek, his face contorted in a grimace of unspoken terror. "The ones who walk the tide," he whispered. "You shouldn't have come here." The widower's blood ran cold. The words were haunting, yet there was something undeniably true about them. He turned to ask more, but when he looked back, the fisherman was gone, disappearing into the mist as though swallowed whole by the very earth. He stood there for a long time, the faintest tremor running through his limbs. Who was the fisherman? And what had he meant by the ones who walked the tide? It wasn't until later that he began to piece together the chilling truth. But by then, it was too late. The first night the footsteps returned, they were different, closer. The creaking of the lodge floorboards as the wind howled through the trees seemed more oppressive than ever, but now he could feel the eyes of something unseen on him. As he paced back to the window, the footsteps paused once again, but this time they were louder, faster. His breath caught in his throat as a shadow shifted along the creek's edge. The tension in the air was thick, suffocating. And then, silence. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity, but nothing came. The widower stood there, staring out into the darkness, his mind racing with questions he could not answer. What was that shadow? Who or what was pacing the creek each night? The creeping dread in his chest seemed to tighten with every passing second. He told himself it was nothing, that his mind was playing tricks on him, but deep down he knew it wasn't just his imagination. Something was out there, something that had been waiting for them. The next morning, he told himself that it had just been the wind, that there was no reason to panic. But when he went to check on the children, he found them sitting together, their faces pale, their eyes wide with terror. "Dad," his daughter whispered, her voice trembling. "We heard them too." His heart skipped a beat. She had heard the footsteps just like him. And that was when he realized, with a sickening twist in his stomach, that they were all caught in something much darker than a simple haunting. It wasn't just the creek, it was the entire lodge, the land surrounding it, and the water itself. Everything felt wrong. And no matter how hard he tried to convince himself that it was all in their heads, the truth was undeniable. The next few days passed in a blur of strange occurrences. The air grew thicker, the mist more persistent, and the trees seemed to whisper in the wind, as though the forest itself was alive and watching them. At night, the footsteps continued, and each time they grew closer, the sound grew more ominous, more deliberate. But it wasn't just the footsteps that terrified him, it was the feeling of being trapped, the knowledge that they were not alone. Every time he ventured outside, the air felt heavier and the water churned with an unnatural energy, as if something deep beneath the surface was stirring. The creek, which had once seemed serene and peaceful, now felt like a prison, pulling them deeper into its embrace. Then, on the fourth night, when the footsteps grew louder than ever, the widower couldn't take it anymore. He rushed outside, hoping for some explanation, some rational reason behind the eerie noises. But what he found was far from rational. The water was rising, swelling unnaturally, creeping higher and higher, and as he stood at the water's edge, he saw something shift beneath the surface. A figure moving beneath the water as though it were walking on the creek bed, its form barely visible through the murky depths. His heart raced and every instinct told him to run, to grab the kids and leave this place behind. But something, some force, held him there, frozen in place. He stared at the water, waiting for whatever it was to reveal itself. And then it did. A hand broke through the surface, followed by another, long and skeletal, its fingers stretching toward the air as though beckoning him. The widower's breath caught in his throat, and he stumbled back, his body shaking uncontrollably. What was this thing? How was it able to move beneath the water like that? As he backed away, he heard the same voice, low and rasping, the voice of the fisherman from days before. "They are coming, you can't stop them." His pulse hammered in his ears as the figure began to rise from the water, his form dark and twisted, a shadow of what it had once been. And then, as if on cue, the earth beneath his feet trembled. The air grew colder, and the water began to churn violently. Panic surged through the widower's veins as the ground beneath his feet seemed to shift, the very earth groaning in protest. The water around the creek began to rise faster, as though the tide itself was alive, seeking something, pulling everything closer to its depths. His eyes darted to his children, still inside the lodge, oblivious to the horrors unfolding outside. But how long would that last? How much time did they have before the creeping terror from the water reached them? The rising figure in the water grew clearer, and as he stepped onto the shore, he could see its face. It was pale, almost translucent, its features twisted and unrecognizable, as though the years it had spent submerged had erased all traces of humanity. The figure reached out, and with a movement as swift as the wind, it seemed to drag itself closer to the lodge. A shadow moving silently against the backdrop of the rising tide. And then, just as the widower took a step back, trying to grasp what was happening, another figure emerged from the water, and then another. They moved like a slow, deliberate procession, their eyes locked on the lodge with an eerie focus. These were not ordinary people. They were something else, something that had waited long in the depths, rising only when the tide was high enough to bring them to land. His breath hitched in his throat as he turned, running back toward the lodge, his footsteps heavy and frantic. The water was coming, and with it, the walking tide. When he burst through the door, he saw his children, their faces frozen in fear. "We need to go," he gasped, his voice shaking. "Now!" But before he could make another move, the door slammed shut behind him with a force that nearly knocked him to the ground. His heart raced as he turned to the window. Outside, he could see the water, now reaching the base of the lodge, its rippling surface reflecting a faint glow. And there, standing at the water's edge, the figures were waiting. They stood perfectly still, as if watching him, their presence an oppressive weight in the air. They knew he could see them. They were waiting for him to come to them, to step into the water and face the unknown. He wanted to run, wanted to grab his children and flee, but he couldn't. Something held him in place, an invisible force tethering him to the lodge. And as the water continued to rise, he realized something that sent a chill through his spine. He wasn't the one being hunted. It was the land itself, the water, the very foundation of the earth around them. And those figures, they were the keepers, the ones who had risen from the depths when the time had come, waiting for the tide to bring them to their final purpose. As the last of the lodge's floorboards cracked beneath his feet, the wind howled and the water surged upward, flooding the lower levels. The figures in the water stepped closer, their eyes now glowing with a faint light, pulling the widower toward them. He wanted to scream, to do anything to break free from their pull, but the words stuck in his throat. He turned to his children, but they too were locked in place, their wide eyes staring at the approaching figures. The fisherman's warning echoed in his mind. "You shouldn't have come here." He realized then, with terrifying clarity, that there was no escaping what was happening. The rising tide wasn't just a physical force, it was a curse, a dark magic tied to the land. And now, the lodge and everything around it were part of that curse. And just when he thought he could fight it no longer, the water surged through the window, crashing into the lodge with an unearthly force, pulling everything in its path toward the water. The widower's vision blurred as he felt himself being dragged toward the tide, the figures closing in around him. The footsteps at the edge of the creek had stopped, and now all that remained was the cold, unrelenting pull of the water, the figures, and the promise of something much darker still waiting beneath.